The morning began in the way so many mornings did for Jacob McGraw, steady and unremarkable, filled with the kind of quiet labor that shaped a man's life on the frontier. The sun had climbed only partway across the sky, but already it bore down on him with a weight that pressed through his hat brim and sank into his shoulders. The air carried no promise of rain. The soil was dry, cracked in places, and the cattle had leaned hard against the fence line in their restless search for greener patches beyond. Jacob's task that morning was simple, though no less backbreaking for its simplicity. Mending rails, setting posts, keeping the border of his world intact. His shirt clung damp to his back, his sleeves rolled up to the elbow. The hammer he gripped was worn smooth at the handle from years of work, the kind of tool that had never known an idle day. The sound of each strike rang out against the post, dull and steady, keeping time with his breathing. A man learned to find rhythm in such tasks, to lose himself in the swing and thud, until sweat and dust blurred into one unbroken moment of toil. It was a rhythm Jacob had lived by all his life. Work, rest, work again. Each fence built, each rail secured, was another line drawn against the wilderness, another stubborn claim staked against forces that always sought to take more than they gave. But that morning, the rhythm broke. At first, he thought it a trick of the wind, the faint vibration underfoot, the whisper of motion carried across the open plain. He paused, hammer raised, head tilted slightly. Then it came again, stronger this time, pulsing through the earth, rattling the wood beneath his hand, a sound no rancher could mistake. Hooves. Jacob straightened, lowering the hammer, his gaze sweeping toward the ridge beyond the pasture. Dust was lifting there, curling into the sky like smoke from a fire. Shapes moved within it, distant but purposeful, their outlines shifting as they advanced. He narrowed his eyes, hand drifting unconsciously toward the fence post where his rifle leaned. The dust thinned for a moment, and the sight came clear. Not strays, not a family wagon nor a band of traders. Riders, dozens of them in ordered line, their ponies keeping pace with one another as if guided by a single thought. Jacob's jaw tightened, the weight of recognition pressing against his chest. It had been years since such a sight had passed across these lands, years since settlers whispered of war parties, of painted faces and silent approaches. The frontier had changed, or so men liked to tell themselves. Treaties signed, bands moved farther west, some gone altogether. Yet here they were, unmistakable, filling the ridge with their presence like a storm cloud sweeping down from the mountains. They came without haste, yet with a force that tightened the very air. Their ponies snorted, hooves drumming a rhythm that rattled the ground beneath Jacob's boots. The sun caught glimmers of steel, rifle barrels, hatchets, blades hung at their sides. But more powerful than the weapons was the silence they carried. No war cry, no chant, only the steady thunder of hooves and the unyielding line of their approach. Jacob remained still. His hand hovered near the rifle, but he did not reach for it. He knew enough to understand that one rifle against a column meant nothing but folly. Instead, he squared his shoulders and stood his ground, watching as they drew closer, the dust rolling outward around them. They slowed at the fence line, halting as one. The sudden stop sent the dust drifting past them in great curling sheets, veiling the prairie in muted tones. Jacob counted at least 30 riders, perhaps more, each one upright and silent, their eyes fixed on him. The world seemed to shrink in that moment, the vast expanse of sky and earth reduced to the narrow stretch of ground between himself and that line of waiting horses. Then, movement. One figure dismounted, the sound of boots striking the earth crisp in the silence. The rider walked forward, leaving the line behind. The others did not stir, did not shift in their saddles. Their discipline was unnerving, their silence heavier than any shout. The figure moved steadily, each step measured, until Jacob could see her clearly. A woman, tall, her bearing proud and unflinching. Her hair, dark as crow's feathers, caught the sun where it was braided back. Her face carried the strength of command, but it was not her expression that held Jacob still. It was the mark across her temple, a scar, pale against her skin, cut cleanly above her brow. The sight struck him like a hammer to the chest. Memory rose unbidden, vivid as if it had happened yesterday. A night of fire, smoke curling through black sky, the crack of rifles in the distance. He remembered the weight of a child in his arms, barely breathing, her small frame shuddering with fever and fear. He had carried her from the wreckage, away from the chaos, delivered her into the hands of her people before soldiers closed the gap. He had turned back then, never knowing if she had lived, never expecting to know. Yet here she stood, no longer the frail child he had pulled from death, but a woman forged in fire and time. Elena White Hawk. She did not raise a weapon. Her hands were empty at her sides. Yet her presence bore the strength of a drawn bow, steady, unrelenting. She stopped a few paces from him, her eyes locking with his. No words passed between them. None were needed. The scar told her story. The years told the rest. She had not forgotten. Jacob felt the weight of it settle deep in his chest. He had thought that night long buried, another chapter in the endless struggle of frontier life. But Elena White Hawk had carried it, carried him across the years. And now she had come, not as memory, not as ghost, but as force. Behind her the line of riders remained still, their silence pressing like a storm waiting to break. Their leader stood between them and Jacob, her gaze never wavering, her steps deliberate and calm. Her message was clear, though no words carried it. Not war, not vengeance. Purpose. Jacob lowered the hammer still clutched in his hand, letting it rest against the fence rail. His heart pounded, but his stance did not falter. He met her gaze, and in that unspoken exchange, the world shifted. The ordinary rhythm of his life, the fences, the cattle, the daily grind, was gone. In its place stood something larger, something that stretched beyond his ranch, beyond the hills, into the heart of justice itself. The past had come riding back, and it had come to stand before him. The silence stretched long between Jacob McGraw and Elena White Hawk. The prairie itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting, as if the wind and grass and dust all knew that something greater than time had come full circle. Jacob's heartbeat slowed, steadying after the first jolt of recognition. He had lived through gunfights and stampedes, through nights when the stars seemed close enough to burn his skin. But nothing in his memory felt like this, standing unarmed before a column of mounted warriors, with the one woman who carried his past looking at him as though the years had never passed. Elena moved first, not with suddenness, not with threat, but with the deliberate certainty of someone who had chosen her ground long before her boots touched it. She raised her hand slowly, palm open, a gesture older than words, heavy with meaning. It was not a warrior's signal to strike. It was something else, an offering of peace, tempered with command. Jacob inclined his head slightly, a measure of respect that came unbidden. He did not lower his eyes. He had learned long ago that some moments demanded a man stand firm, not out of pride, but to show that he would meet truth without turning aside. The dust curled between them as Elena's hand lowered. She drew a breath, and when her voice came, it was clear, measured, and strong. She spoke his name. It was not the clipped, rough manner of a settler saying, McGraw. It was drawn out with precision, each syllable pronounced as if carried with care across time itself. The sound of it reached deep inside Jacob, stirring something he had not expected. How long had it been since anyone spoke his name with such weight? Then she told him what he had half guessed but not dared to believe. She was the girl, the child he had carried 15 years before, weak and dying, smoke choking her lungs, her tiny frame trembling in his arms. She touched her brow, where the pale scar caught the sunlight, and her words bound the memory to the present. The child he had once saved had lived, and she had become this. Jacob's throat tightened. For a moment he almost faltered under the wave of memory, but Elena gave him no chance to linger in the past. Her voice shifted, sharpened, as if turning a blade from one edge to another. She said she had not come to repay him with mere thanks. She had not brought riders across the plains to offer a token. She had come because the balance of justice demanded it. Her words carried the ring of judgment, not against Jacob, but against another. She told him of the land baron, Randall Pike, a name that already brought a heaviness to Jacob's mind. Pike, with his sprawling operations, his merciless appetite for more land, more cattle, more control. A man who wore respectability like a polished coat, hiding the corruption that festered beneath. Elena spoke plainly, sparing Jacob no detail. Pike had filed a claim with the local authority, declaring that Jacob owed him a debt. $800. Forged against Jacob's name, tied to contracts and witnesses that did not exist. A legal snare, carefully woven, designed to choke the life from a man before he even knew he was caught. Jacob's hands curled into fists at his sides. $800. Enough to ruin him, to strip away his ranch, his cattle, everything he had built with his own blood and sweat. He had never seen such a sum in one place in his life, let alone owed it. Elena's voice carried no pity. She did not soften the truth. She told him this was not the first time Pike had played such a game. 16 ranches had already fallen to the same scheme. Families driven from their land, their homes seized under the cold authority of stamped paper and legal ink. Pike had left ruin in his wake, not through gunfire or open theft, but through the slow, deliberate tightening of a noose woven from law itself. The riders behind Eleanor shifted slightly, though still silent, their presence a living wall of resolve. Jacob understood then. They had not come as conquerors. They had come as witnesses, as shields against the machinery of a man who thought no one could oppose him. Elena's gaze did not waver as she spoke of her debt. 15 years ago, Jacob had saved her life. Today, she had come to save his, not through force of arms, but through the weapons she had gathered in her long absence. Her story unfolded, not as boast, but as testament. When she had disappeared from these lands, she had not vanished into shadow. She had gone east, far beyond the rivers and plains, into cities of stone and glass, where the power of men like Pike was born and nurtured. She had walked halls of learning, studied law and business, read the language of contracts and banks. She had learned how men with polished boots and smooth words wove their nets, how they bought silence and sold lies. She had not done this for herself. She had done it for this moment. From her satchel, she drew papers. Records, testimonies, depositions sworn by clerks who had seen too much, by bookkeepers who had grown sick of carrying Pike's lies, bank ledgers marked with evidence no man could deny. A clerk, once deep in Pike's employ, had written every detail of his deceit in a hidden journal, waiting for the day truth could be brought to light. Elena's voice steadied further as she revealed the most pressing truth. Pike's next move was already in motion. Tomorrow, he would arrive with the local authority at his side, bearing an official seizure order. He would come not as outlaw, but as law itself, ready to tear Jacob's ranch from him in broad daylight, under the cover of legal decree. Jacob's gut twisted. He had known men like Pike all his life, predators cloaked in civility, wolves that prowled with silver tongues instead of sharpened teeth. But to hear it laid so bare, to know the trap was already closing, sent a cold fury burning through his chest. Elena's words did not falter. She told him plainly that Pike expected him to resist, perhaps even to fall in violence. That was the way of such men. Set the stage, control the law, and then brand the victim an outlaw when he dared to fight back. But she had come to cut through that stage with truth, to turn Pike's own weapons against him. Her eyes locked on Jacob's once more, the scar above her brow a mark not of weakness, but of survival. She told him the debt she owed was not one of money or land, but of honor. He had saved her life. She would save his name, his ranch, his future. Jacob stood silent as her words settled into him. Around them, the prairie stretched endless, the dust still hanging where the riders waited. He felt the weight of years pressing on him, 15 years of work, sweat, and stubborn survival. And for the first time, he saw how close he had come to losing it all, without even knowing the danger was at his door. The hammer still lay against the rail where he had left it. The fence post stood unfinished. The work of one man seemed so small now when measured against the storm riding toward him. But he was not alone. Elena Whitehawk had returned, not as the child he had saved, but as a woman armed with knowledge, allies, and a purpose as unshakable as the scar on her brow. She had named the threat. She had named the debt. And in doing so, she had given Jacob something no fence, no rifle, no solitary labor could have secured, hope that justice might yet prevail. The war party behind her remained silent, their presence a living reminder of the promise she carried. They had not come for conquest, they had come for justice, and tomorrow, when Randall Pike arrived with his forged decree and his hollow authority, he would not find the prey he expected. He would find a reckoning. The riders still held their place along the fence, silent, unmoving, the weight of their presence stretching across the prairie like a living wall. Elena Whitehawk stood before Jacob McGraw, the scar upon her temple catching the light, her voice carrying the cadence of judgment and memory. The truth she had laid before him was heavy enough to silence the world, yet she was not finished. Her story had only begun. She drew a slow breath, her gaze shifting briefly toward her people, then returning to Jacob with unflinching steadiness. She told him what had filled the long years between the night of fire and this moment. Years Jacob had wondered about. Years that now unfolded like pages of a book written in blood, sweat, and relentless pursuit of knowledge. When she had been carried away from death's door as a child, her body frail and failing, her people had feared she would not see another sunrise. But she had clung to life with a ferocity born of something greater than will alone. In time, when strength returned, she had faced a choice: remain among her people, or follow a path few had ever taken. She had chosen the harder path. Her journey had taken her east, farther than Jacob had ever gone, beyond the rivers and mountains, into cities that seemed like worlds unto themselves. Places where the streets echoed not with the cries of cattle or the howl of coyotes, but with the clamor of wheels, voices, and endless commerce. She had walked beneath stone buildings that rose like cliffs, beneath windows that gleamed like water in the sun. There, she had entered schools, places Jacob could hardly imagine, where knowledge was written not in sweat upon the land, but in books stacked higher than a man could reach. She had studied with the same resolve that had carried her through fever as a child, the same fire that had kept her alive when others thought her lost. Elena spoke of laws, pages filled with words that seemed harmless, yet could strip a man of everything he owned. She told Jacob how she had learned to read them not as symbols of justice, but as weapons wielded by those who knew how to bend them. Contracts, clauses, signatures, each one a blade sharper than steel, cutting deeper than any knife when placed in the wrong hands. She had studied business as well, tracing how wealth was moved, how land was claimed and stolen, how banks kept men in chains without ever binding their wrists. She learned the language of ledgers, the numbers that men like Pike used to cloak their lies in the garb of legitimacy. But her education had not stopped at theory. She had sought out those willing to speak truth against power. Clerks who had seen bribes passed in quiet corners, bookkeepers who had watched honest records twisted into chains, men and women who had once served masters like Pike, but had grown sick under the weight of their corruption. She had listened, learned, and gathered their words, their names, their sworn testimonies. Jacob listened in silence, his weathered face betraying little, though inside his heart pounded like a drum. He had lived his life by the sweat of his hands, by fences built and cattle driven, by the honest exchange of labor for survival. The world Elena described was one he barely understood. Ink and parchment wielded like pistols, signatures as deadly as rifles. Yet as she spoke, he saw the shape of Pike's snare more clearly than ever before. He understood how a man could be robbed without a single shot fired. Elena's voice did not waver as she revealed what she carried. From her satchel she produced a bundle bound in leather, its weight evident even before she untied the strap. She held it not as one displays a trophy, but as a warrior would carry a weapon, firm, deliberate, with purpose. Inside were the fruits of 15 years of labor, depositions sworn by men who had once served Pike, bank records that revealed patterns no honest rancher could make, letters signed in secret, their ink betraying the hand of forgery, and most damning of all, the journal of a clerk who had lived in Pike's shadow, writing down every false deal, every fabricated debt, every bribe paid to keep the machinery turning. Jacob stared at the papers, their edges frayed from travel, their ink still sharp upon the page. To him they were only markings, words he could not easily decipher, but he did not need to read them to feel their weight. He knew a weapon when he saw one, even if it was ink instead of iron. Elena lifted her eyes to his once more, her words carrying the cold clarity of inevitability. Randall Pike was coming. Tomorrow. Not as outlaw, not with hired guns, but with the local authority at his side. He would ride up the lane with papers in hand, stamped and sealed, declaring Jacob McGraw indebted, his land seized, his home stripped away. He would come cloaked in law, carrying the force of authority. But Elena Whitehawk had built her defense for this very day. She warned Jacob of Pike's intent beyond the seizure. The man's schemes did not end at the boundaries of paper. Once the ranch was claimed, Pike planned to erase Jacob entirely. The seizure would be only the beginning. Violence would follow, quiet, staged to look like resistance gone too far, perhaps a fire that consumed the house, leaving nothing but ash. Pike had no intention of leaving Jacob alive to challenge him. The words settled like iron in Jacob's chest. For a long moment he said nothing, the prairie wind whispering low through the grass, as if even the land itself listened. All his years of labor, of bending his back beneath sun and storm, of carving a life from the hard earth, it all hung in the balance. And yet, despite the fury burning beneath his ribs, he felt something else rising, something steadier. He was not alone. Elena's eyes held his without flinching. She had carried her debt across 15 years, through cities and schools, through books and battles fought in silence. And now she stood here, not as the child he had saved, but as the woman who had returned to save him. The war party behind her remained still, their silence carrying more weight than any cry of war. They were not here to raid, not here to claim. They were here because Eleanor had called them, because they trusted her judgment, because they had chosen to stand for justice in a land where justice was too often bought and sold. Jacob drew a slow breath, the dust of the prairie filling his lungs. Tomorrow Randall Pike would come, bringing the false authority of paper and seal. But tomorrow he would also face something he had never reckoned with, truth forged over years, carried on the scar of a child who had survived when he thought she would not. The strategy had been revealed. The trap Pike had built was about to turn upon him. The prairie held its silence long after Eleanor Whitehawk revealed her plan, as if the land itself weighed her words. The afternoon sun burned lower now, stretching shadows across Jacob McGraw's fence line. The riders still sat mounted in perfect stillness, but their presence felt less like a storm on the horizon and more like the heavy calm that follows one. Yet if Jacob thought the worst of Elena's revelations had passed, he was mistaken. She had shown him the shape of the trap Randall Pike had set, and the evidence she had gathered to undo it, but there was more. A darker thread still lay tangled in the story, and it had been wound close to Jacob's own life. Elena's gaze shifted from the horizon back to Jacob, steady and unblinking. Her voice carried not only resolve, but a weight of sorrow, as though what she spoke next cost her something to bring into the open. She told him Pike's scheme had not been aimed blindly. Jacob had not been chosen at random, nor simply as another rancher to be stripped of land and livelihood. He had been singled out, targeted. The seizure of his ranch was not merely business, it was vengeance. The name came sharp as a knife. Dr. Silas Turner, the town's physician, a man Jacob had known for years, though never trusted. Turner wore the air of respectability, with his polished spectacles and practiced bedside manner, but beneath it, Jacob had always sensed something hollow. The man charged more than he ought, lingered longer than necessary when collecting debts, and seemed to watch others' misfortune with too much interest. Elena explained the tie. Turner's father, long dead now, had once held Jacob's past in his hands. It was Turner's father who had known of the night Jacob carried a fevered child out of fire and smoke. He had known where Jacob had taken her, had known her people claimed her. And that man, in his weakness and greed, had sold the story. He had traded it to Pike to settle debts, thinking little of the long shadow it might cast. That betrayal had planted the seed. Pike, ever the opportunist, had nurtured it, biding his time until the day came when he could wield it as a weapon. By painting Jacob not as a rescuer, but as a collaborator, a traitor who harbored fugitives, Pike could poison his name before the local authority. He could strip not only Jacob's land, but his honor. Jacob's jaw clenched, the lines in his weathered face deepening. Betrayal was no stranger on the frontier. Men lied, men stole, men fought over scraps of land or cattle. But this was different. This was treachery that reached back through the years, twisting an act of compassion into a weapon sharpened for his destruction. Elena did not stop there. She reached into her satchel once more, drawing out a smaller bundle, aged papers, fragile with time, their ink faded but still legible. These, she said, were the records left behind by Turner's father himself. In them he had written of the child Jacob saved, not as a fugitive, not as a threat, but as a dying girl, stricken with fever and smoke. His notes spoke of her frailty, her weakness, her near brush with death. Those records were the blade to cut Pike's noose. They told the truth. Jacob had not aided a fugitive, but had carried a child clinging to life. The words of the physician's father, once meant for no eyes but his own, now stood as testimony that could unravel Pike's lie. Jacob let out a long, steady breath, though it did little to cool the fire in his chest. He had always known Pike was a snake, always suspected Turner was little better, but to see their threads woven together into this tapestry of deceit, it was a bitter revelation. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the distant lowing of cattle and the restless shift of horses, hooves in the dust. Finally, Eleanor lifted her eyes from the papers and spoke again, her tone edged with steel. Dr. Silas Turner was not merely Pike's tool, he was his partner. Where Pike stole land, Turner profited in flesh and need. Families stripped of their homes turned to him for care when sickness struck, when hunger hollowed their children, when desperation drove them to his door. And Turner, with his clean hands and hollow smile, took their coins, their livestock, their last scraps of hope. He grew fat on the suffering Pike created, a carrion bird feeding on the carcass of broken lives. Jacob's stomach twisted. He had seen families driven from their land, seen them load wagons with what little they could carry, faces set in grim silence. He had offered food when he could, water when they passed his gate, but he had never known the full measure of the noose around their throats. Now he saw it clear. Pike robbed them of their homes. Turner robbed them of their survival. Together, they were not content merely to prosper. They thrived on ruin. Elena let the weight of her words sink before she revealed what she carried next. From her satchel she withdrew a small leather bag, the kind physicians often carried, though this one bore the smell not of chemicals or alcohol, but of earth and leaves. She opened it carefully, revealing vials filled with concentrated extracts drawn from roots and plants Jacob only half recognized. These, she explained, were remedies of her people, ancient, proven by generations, but in the right measure they could do more than heal. One in particular could induce sickness, sudden, severe, but not fatal. A dose mixed into drink would twist the stomach, sap the strength, bring fever and sweats that no man could ignore. Jacob's eyes narrowed as the shape of her plan became clear. Elena spoke it plain. When Pike arrived, Jacob would offer him coffee. Within, it would be the extract. Soon after drinking, Pike would fall ill before the eyes of the local authority. His body would betray his strength, his sickness undeniable. And in that moment, all would turn to Dr. Turner. If Turner did what a true physician should, if he placed his patient above all else, perhaps he could redeem some measure of his soul. But Elena's gaze hardened, for she knew what he would do. Turner's greed would drive him to ignore the man's suffering, to press forward with the seizure, to reveal where his loyalty truly lay. And when he did, the trap would close. Jacob stood silent, the pieces settling into place, the papers, the testimonies, the father's records, the extracts. It was a plan not of violence but of exposure. To lay bare the rot festering beneath Pike's polished veneer and Turner's false respectability. For a moment, Jacob looked past Elena, toward the horizon where the sun dipped lower, casting the land in hues of gold and blood. Tomorrow, Pike would ride that way, bearing his order, his lies, his corruption wrapped in the seal of law. But tomorrow, he would face more than a lone rancher. He would face the truth. Elena's hand closed the satchel with deliberate care. She looked at Jacob with eyes that carried both the weight of history and the fire of resolve. She reminded him again, this was not chance. He had been marked because he had once saved her life. Pike's vengeance was rooted in that night. But vengeance cut both ways. Jacob lifted his gaze, meeting hers. He felt the fury of betrayal, the sting of lies, the looming shadow of danger. But beneath it all, he felt something stronger, a quiet, unshakable resolve. If Pike thought he had chosen his victim well, he was mistaken. The sun had begun its slow descent by the time Elena Whitehawk finished laying bare the betrayal of Dr. Silas Turner and the role Randall Pike had played in shaping Jacob McGraw's looming downfall. The prairie stretched out in gold and shadow, the horizon shimmering as if fire smoldered beneath the edge of the world. Jacob stood still, his calloused hands resting against the fence post he had been mending when the day had turned. His life, once measured by the steady rhythm of hammer strikes and the slow work of cattle and soil, now balanced on the edge of a knife. Eleanor, calm as stone, lifted the leather satchel again and set it on the rail between them. Her fingers moved with practiced care as she untied the strap, revealing the vials and pouches within. Her weapons, though no gunpowder or steel, rested among them. Instead, the satchel carried the distilled power of roots and leaves, knowledge drawn from the deep well of her people's medicine. Jacob leaned closer, his brow furrowed, as she drew forth one vial. The liquid inside was dark, thick, catching the last light of the sun with a dull gleam. Elena explained what it was, an extract prepared from a plant that grew only in shaded hollows, its leaves bitter, its roots carrying a potency that could not be mistaken. A small measure in water or coffee, she said, was enough to strike a man with sudden, unrelenting illness, not poison, not death. but a storm that would tear through the body, leaving weakness, sweat, and fever. The kind of sickness that no honest physician could ignore. Jacob's jaw tightened as the meaning unfolded. Pike would ride to his door tomorrow with arrogance in his step and the false strength of paper in his hand. Jacob would meet him not with gunfire nor resistance, but with hospitality, the simple ritual of offering a cup of coffee. Pike would drink, and then the trap would spring, not with bullets but with his own failing body. Elena's plan moved beyond Pike himself, for when the sickness struck, all eyes would turn to Dr. Turner. It would be his duty, his oath, his very profession, to set aside all else and tend to his patient. But Turner's greed ran deeper than his craft, his loyalty tied not to the man's health but to Pike's schemes. If Turner ignored the sickness, if he pressed forward with the seizure order, unmoved by Pike's pain, then his corruption would shine plain before the local authority. The facade of the respectable town physician would crack, and beneath it the truth would be laid bare. Jacob's gaze lingered on the vial, his thoughts heavy. He had always been a man of direct action, his solutions found in sweat and grit, in the steady work of his hands. This was strategy of another kind, subtle, calculated, a battle fought not with lead but with truth, revealed at the right moment. And yet he saw the wisdom. He had faced men like Pike before, though never one so bold, so cloaked in authority. To fight him with gun or fist would play into his hands, would prove the outlaw Pike intended to paint him as. But to let Pike's own ally betray him in front of the law, that was a reckoning far sharper. Eleanor placed the vial back in its pouch and closed the satchel with deliberate care. Her eyes lifted to Jacob's, and in them he saw not triumph, but the quiet weight of responsibility. This was no game to her. It was justice, justice sharpened by patience, tempered by knowledge, aimed at men who believed themselves untouchable. But she did not stop there. Her voice grew lower, steady as the hum of wind over the grass, as she revealed the full shape of Pike's plan. The forged debt, the seizure order, the smear of Jacob's name, these were only the beginning. Pike intended not only to take the ranch, but to destroy the man who owned it. He would not be content with Jacob's eviction. He would not risk leaving a man behind who might rally others, who might speak truth loud enough to shake his grip. Pike meant to see Jacob silenced forever. The ranch house, Eleanor said, was marked for fire. After the seizure, when the papers were signed and the authority had turned its eyes away, Pike's men would put torch to the timbers, leaving only ash where Jacob had lived. Ash, and the story of a stubborn rancher who resisted too hard and paid the price. Jacob's face hardened, every line etched deeper by the revelation. He had long suspected Pike's ruthlessness, but hearing it spoken with such certainty lit a cold fire in his chest. To be stolen from was one thing. To be buried in lies and ash was another. Eleanor's gaze did not falter. She told him the truth because he deserved nothing less, but she also told him this: Pike's cruelty would not prevail. Not tomorrow. Not with the evidence she carried, not with the riders who stood behind her, not with the plan she had set in motion. The prairie stretched wide around them, but in that moment it felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls of the coming conflict had already risen. Jacob knew there would be no turning back. Tomorrow Randall Pike would ride to his gate with law in his pocket and Turner at his side. But tomorrow would not be his victory. Tomorrow would be his undoing. The riders shifted behind Elena, the sun's last light flashing against their painted shields and polished rifle barrels. Their silence was not the silence of indifference, but of shared resolve. They had not come for war, but neither had they come idly. They were here to stand as witnesses, as the shield and strength of a woman who had carried her debt across 15 years and returned with a reckoning in her hand. Jacob straightened, his hands tightening into fists before he let them fall open again. The fence remained unfinished. The hammer lay where he had dropped it, but the work of the day no longer mattered. A greater task lay before him now, not to mend rails, but to stand against the weight of deceit and survive the storm that would come. Elena's plan was clear, every step as sharp and deliberate as the strike of a blacksmith's hammer. The bait had been set. The snare was ready. Tomorrow, all that remained was for Pike and Turner to walk willingly into it. The prairie wind carried the scent of dust and dry grass as the last light faded. Jacob lifted his gaze to the horizon, his heart heavy, but his spirit steady. He was no longer the solitary man repairing his fence. He was the fulcrum of justice long overdue, and tomorrow would decide more than his fate alone. The trap had been set. Now they would wait for the prey to step into it. The dawn came slow and heavy, as if the sky itself hesitated to unveil the day that would bring reckoning to the plains. Jacob McGraw rose before the first light, his body aching with the familiar stiffness of a rancher's life. But his spirit charged with something heavier, sharper. Sleep had not come easy. His dreams had been haunted by fire and shadow, by the echo of Elena Whitehawk, S-words. They mean to burn you in your home. He stood in the doorway of his ranch house, the horizon still blue with night, and watched the first pale ribbon of sunlight split the sky. The land stretched out quiet and endless, but Jacob knew that peace was a lie. Today, Randall Pike would come with his forged paper, with Marshal Royce Callahan to give the scheme its veneer of law, and with Dr. Ambrose Holt lurking at his side. And behind Pike's measured arrogance lay something darker, plans of ash, smoke, and silence. Jacob's hands tightened around the coffee pot as he stoked the morning fire. The simple ritual of boiling water, grinding beans, setting cups on the table, it all felt heavier now, part of a stage being set. For today, every detail mattered. Elena had left him with the vial, a small thing of glass and dark liquid that now seemed to weigh more than iron in his pocket. He would use it, though every instinct in him bristled at the thought of deceit. But Elena S. words had cut true. To fight Pike on Pike, S terms was to lose. The only way to survive was to let Pike and Holt damn themselves with their own choices. The hours stretched long as Jacob waited. He worked the corrals, checked the water troughs, anything to keep his hands busy. But his eyes never strayed far from the eastern horizon. The sun climbed higher, the light grew harsher, and the air thickened with the weight of expectation. Even the cattle seemed restless, shifting and lowing as though they too sensed the storm approaching. By late morning, the dust plume rose, distant at first, then swelling larger as hooves pounded the dry earth. Jacob wiped his hands on his trousers and stood straight, watching as 3 riders broke from the horizon. Pike rode in the lead, tall in the saddle, his suit tailored sharp even beneath the dust of the trail. Behind him came Marshal Royce Callahan, broad-shouldered, grim beneath his hat, the badge gleaming against his chest. And flanking them was Dr. Ambrose Holt, thin and hawk-faced, his black coat too fine for the prairie, his eyes darting with a hunger that had little to do with medicine. They reined up at Jacob's gate, dust settling around them like a shroud. Pike smiled first, smug, practiced, the smile of a man convinced he had already won. He dismounted with a flourish, boots striking Jacob's soil as though it already belonged to him. The marshal followed slower, deliberate, his gaze steady but unreadable. Holt lingered in his saddle until Pike gestured, and then he too climbed down, his doctor's bag clutched like a weapon of another kind. Jacob stepped forward, his voice steady though his blood pounded in his ears. He welcomed them, the words plain, courteous, the way one host greets another. Pike smirked at the civility, but Jacob saw his eyes flick toward the house, already envisioning it as his prize. Inside, the air was cooler, shadows stretching across the wood floors. Jacob poured coffee with the slow precision of a man who wanted no misstep. The pot steamed, the cups clinked, and from his pocket he drew Elena's vial, tilting it just enough to let a few drops fall into Pike's cup. The dark liquid swirled, vanished into the blackness of the coffee. He set the cup before Pike with a steady hand, offering the others theirs untouched. Pike, never doubting, lifted it at once. He drank deep, as though claiming dominion over even the smallest act of hospitality. Jacob's stomach tightened, but his face betrayed nothing. Then the business began. Pike withdrew the papers from his satchel, laying them across Jacob's table as though they were chains forged of ink. He spoke of debts unpaid, of $800 owed, of foreclosure and seizure. His voice rang with authority, each word rehearsed, every phrase crafted to sound inevitable. Holt nodded along, lips pressed thin, while the marshal listened, his eyes never leaving Jacob's face. Jacob answered, calm, measured, denying nothing but conceding less. He did not raise his voice, did not plead. He simply held his ground as he always had, knowing what would come. And then it came. Pike faltered. His hand trembled as it rested on the paper, his brow beaded with sudden sweat, the smugness drained from his face, replaced by a flush of pain. He shifted in his chair, coughed, then clutched at his stomach with a low groan. The words stumbled on his tongue, slurred, collapsed into silence. His skin grew pale, his breath shallow, his whole frame racked with a sickness that had struck as swift as lightning. The room tensed. Holt leaned forward, his eyes sharp, but instead of rushing to his patient, he froze, calculating. Pike gasped, his voice breaking as he demanded aid, but Holt's gaze flickered to the marshal, then to the papers still on the table. His priorities weighed against each other, and Holt hesitated. Jacob saw it then, as Elena had promised. The doctor's oath lay buried beneath his greed. Holt reached for the documents first, not his bag. He muttered about finishing the business, about seizing the land, his hand twitching toward the marshal as though urging him to sign before Pike lost consciousness. Marshal Callahan's face darkened. His jaw tightened as he watched the physician ignore the man writhing before them. Jacob said nothing. He didn't need to. The truth was unfolding plain as day. The trap sprung not by Jacob's hand, but by Holt's own corruption. Pike groaned louder, his pride stripped bare, his power laid low by his own weakness. Holt hovered, torn between medicine and ambition, and in that hesitation his mask slipped. The marshal saw it, Jacob saw it, and in that moment the tide turned. What began as a seizure of land was now unraveling into something far larger. The confrontation had begun. The air inside Jacob McGraw's ranch house was thick, heavy with the bitter smell of coffee and sweat. Randall Pike hunched over the table, his face ashen, his fine suit clinging damp to his shoulders. Each breath rattled through him, shallow and labored, his hand clutching his stomach as though he might claw the sickness out by force. Dr. Ambrose Holt hovered nearby, the polished brass of his physician's bag catching the light, but his eyes were not on the patient. They darted instead toward the papers on the table, the forged debt, the seizure order, the very instruments of Pike's power. His fingers twitched above them, desperate to press the marshal into signing before the last shred of Pike's composure collapsed. But Marshal Royce Callahan was no fool. He stood firm, his boots planted wide, his broad shoulders squared as he watched Holt's hesitation. Pike's groans filled the silence. A man brought low, not by bullet or blade, but by the frailty of his own flesh, and by the greed of the ally who now betrayed him with every passing second of inaction. It was then the sound came, the steady, deliberate rhythm of hoofbeats drawing closer. At first faint, like a memory drifting across the plains, then louder, heavier, until the floorboards themselves seemed to hum with the weight of approaching riders. Holt froze, his hand still hovering above the papers. Pike stirred weakly, his eyes fluttering open, fear flickering there for the first time. The door swung wide, and there she was. Elena Whitehawk stepped into the room, tall and unyielding, her presence filling the space as surely as the light spilling in behind her. She wore no war paint now, no armor of riders at her back, only the plain strength of truth carried in her bearing. Yet Jacob saw the faint scar along her jaw, the same mark she had revealed to him only yesterday, and he knew her resolve was carved as deep as that line upon her skin. Her gaze swept the room once, sharp as a hawk's flight. It lingered on Pike's trembling form, then on Holt's pale, calculating face. And when her eyes met Jacob's, there was no need for words. He had held the line until she arrived. Now the time for revelation had come. Elena strode forward, and from the satchel at her side she drew a leather-bound book, its edges worn with age. She laid it on the table beside Pike's seizure order, the weight of it more damning than any weapon. "This," she said, her voice steady as stone, "is the journal of Elias Holt." Jacob felt the room shift. The name struck Dr. Holt like a blow. He flinched, his lips parting, a protest forming but never spoken. The marshal's eyes narrowed, his interest sharpened. Eleanor opened the journal, the pages brittle but clear. She turned to a passage and read aloud, not in the voice of accusation, but in the plain words Elias himself had once written. Notes of a child patient, dying of fever and malnutrition. A girl left at death's door, brought into a stranger's care. The doctor had written of her frailty, of her hopeless prognosis, of the kindness shown by the ranch hand who had carried her bleeding body to safety. Jacob's throat tightened as the words rang out. 15 years vanished in a breath, and he was once again that younger man, kneeling in the dust with a half-conscious child in his arms. The girl who had lived, Elena herself, now stood before him, reading the record of her own survival. Elena lifted her chin, eyes flashing toward Dr. Holt. "Your father wrote this truth. He knew I was no fugitive. He knew Jacob McGraw was no traitor. And yet you sold the story of my escape to Pike, twisted by lies, so that his hands might tighten around every ranch in this valley. Your father left the truth behind, and today it stands against you." Dr. Holt sputtered, his composure unraveling. He reached for the journal, but the marshal's hand came down heavy on the table, pinning it in place. Holt's eyes flickered from the lawman's stern gaze to Pike's gasping form, then back again. For once, no words came to save him. But Elena was not finished. From her satchel she drew another book, this one smaller, its ink fresher, its entries sharp and precise. "And this," she said, "is the ledger of Pike's clerk. Every forged signature, every fraudulent debt, every bribe paid to smooth his theft. I hold sworn statements, banking records, testimony prepared to show before a judge." She laid the ledger beside the journal, the two volumes together forming the weight of a mountain upon the fragile scaffolding of Pike's empire. Pike groaned, his hand slamming weakly against the table as though to scatter the evidence, but his strength failed him. Sweat poured down his face, his lips trembling, his power stripped bare. The marshal's voice finally broke the silence, low and stern. "Is this true, Holt? You sold lies to prop this man up while he stole 16 families from their land?" Holt faltered, his mouth dry, his words stumbling. Marshal, I provided services. I only—" He stopped. The sound had come again, the thunder of hooves now far closer, rattling windows and floorboards alike. Jacob turned toward the open door, just as the first riders crested the rise. They came not as scattered neighbors, but as a column, 16 families strong, each carrying papers, letters, deeds, and ledgers of their own. Men and women rode side by side, their children clinging to saddles, their faces lined with years of hardship endured under Pike's theft. They filled the yard outside, dust rising around them like smoke, their presence undeniable. Eleanor stepped aside, allowing them to be seen, her voice rising like a herald. "These are the ones you wronged, Pike. 16 families robbed of their homes, their cattle, their names dragged through mud by forged debts. Each carries their own evidence, their own testimony, and today they ride not to beg but to bear witness." Marshal Callahan turned, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, the weight of law in his bearing suddenly doubled by the weight of the people's will. He looked back to Pike, slumped and moaning, and then to Holt, pale and trembling. The trap had been sprung. The sickness in Pike's body was only a spark. The real fire now roared in the form of undeniable truth. Jacob stood tall, silent, his presence steady as the earth beneath their feet. He had offered coffee. He had endured the charade, and now the reckoning was no longer his to carry alone. Elena had returned, the families had risen, and the law had been forced to see. The evidence lay plain upon the table. The judgment hung in the marshal's hands, and the storm that had gathered for so long now broke in full. The ranch house stood silent for a long moment, as if the very walls strained to hear what Marshal Royce Callahan would say. The only sounds were Randall Pike's ragged breathing, the restless stamping of horses outside, and the murmured voices of 16 families gathered in the yard, their weight pressing against the day like a tide rising against a seawall. Marshal Callahan's gaze moved from the ledger on the table to Elena Whitehawk, then to Jacob McGraw. His jaw tightened as he drew in a slow breath. The authority of his badge was no longer enough to hide behind indecision. He had come here to execute a seizure, to strip Jacob's land from him by the letter of Pike's false claim. But now the truth sat plain before him, undeniable, weightier than any forged paper. "Silas Blackthorne," he said at last, his voice carrying like a gavel strike, "you stand accused of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy against these families whose lands you stole. Every deed, every signature, every so-called debt is laid bare as false. You'll answer for it in court." Pike groaned, his body bent over in sickness, his fine clothes clinging to him like rags in a storm. His lips moved, spitting curses too weak to carry. The power that had once draped around him like a cloak was stripped away, leaving him only a sick man cornered by his own greed. Marshal Callahan turned then, his eyes narrowing on Dr. Ambrose Holt. "And you," he said, his voice colder now, "abandoned your oath as a physician. You conspired with this man, profited from his thefts, and stood idle while he suffered before your very eyes. You'll answer as an accessory, and as a disgrace to your calling." Holt staggered back, his face pale, sweat beading his brow. He stammered half-formed protests, but the voices from outside drowned him out. The families had drawn closer, their faces fierce with long-held anger. One woman lifted a crumpled deed high, her voice cutting through the air. "This was my father's land, stolen with your signature on it." Another man shouted, "You left my wife to die when we couldn't pay Piker's fee for medicine." Their accusations fell like stones, striking Holt harder than any fist. His composure cracked. He tried to retreat, his hand clutching at his doctor's bag like a shield, but the marshal stepped between him and the door. "You'll face them in court," Callahan said, iron in his tone, "and you'll face the law besides." Jacob McGraw stood silent at the edge of it all, his arms folded across his chest, the weight of 15 years of quiet living pressing against the storm that had broken inside his home. He had not sought this day. He had not asked for Elena's return, nor for the truth to sweep into his life like a wildfire. But as he looked at Pike, broken and trembling, and at Holt, pale and undone, he felt the deep, steady certainty that justice, long delayed, had finally arrived. Elena Whitehawk moved to his side, her scar catching the light, her presence unshaken. She did not gloat, nor revel in the downfall of her enemies. She had carried her debt across half a lifetime, and now she had paid it in full, not with blood, but with truth. Marshal Callahan gave the order, and deputies from among the riders stepped forward. Pike and Holt were bound, their protest drowned beneath the steady rhythm of ropes tightening. The papers of seizure were swept from the table, cast aside like the lies they were. Outside, the families erupted, not in wild cheers, but in a tide of relief. Tears shone in weathered eyes. Husbands gripped wives' hands. Children clung to their mothers, their futures restored in an instant. The land that had been stolen would be theirs again, not by favor but by right. Jacob stepped into the doorway, the sunlight spilling across his face. He looked out at the crowd gathered in his yard. 16 families who had suffered as he had nearly suffered, and for a moment he felt the weight of being part of something larger than his own quiet struggle. He had been one man standing against a storm, but now the valley stood with him. Elena joined him at the threshold, her gaze scanning the faces of those who had come. Some of the riders bowed their heads toward her, a silent acknowledgement of the role she had played in their deliverance. Others looked at Jacob with gratitude, remembering the man who had once risked himself for a child, thought beyond saving. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the land, but the air seemed lighter now, the heaviness broken. Pike and Holt were led away under guard, their empire crumbling behind them. Marshal Callahan gathered the evidence into his satchel, his face grim but resolute. "This valley will see justice," he said, "and I'll see it done." For the first time in weeks, Jacob allowed himself to breathe without weight pressing on his chest. He turned to Elena, his voice low, steady. "It's over." But Elena's eyes told him different. "No, Jacob, this is only the beginning. The land is restored, the thieves unmasked, but the work of rebuilding lies ahead." Her words rang true. Justice had been served, but healing would take time. Families would return to homes long empty, fields left untended would need ploughing, herds scattered would need gathering, and in the quiet spaces of those labors, scars would remain, the memory of what had been lost, and of how close they had come to losing all. Yet hope had returned, and with it the promise of something more enduring than theft or lies, the strength of a community bound not by fear, but by truth. 3 months passed, and the valley bloomed again. The courts had spoken, sentencing Randall Pike to years behind iron bars for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Dr. Ambrose Holt had been stripped of his license, found guilty as an accessory, and sent east to face his disgrace in prison. The 16 families returned to their lands, their properties restored, their names cleared. Laughter returned to porches. Smoke rose once more from chimneys long cold, and the cattle roamed again across fields that had nearly been lost forever. Elena Whitehawk remained, not as a shadow of the past, but as a presence shaping the future. The state offered her a role as liaison, bridging the voices of her people and the courts of law she had studied. It was a place she had earned through both heritage and education, through fire and patience alike. Jacob McGraw found himself at a crossroads. The ranch still stood, the fields still needed tending, but he saw something more ahead. He had spoken often of breeding horses, strong, swift stock that could serve both settler and rider alike. And one evening, as the sun sank low, he turned to Eleanor with an offer. Not repayment, not obligation, but partnership, an equal share in building something new, not born of debt, but of choice. She accepted with a nod, her hand clasping his in a grip that sealed more than a bargain. It bound the past to the future, a debt of compassion transformed into a bond of enterprise. Together they looked out across the valley, no longer as a rancher and a girl once saved, but as partners in the shaping of what lay ahead. The prairie wind stirred, carrying with it the scents of dust and grass, the whispers of all that had been endured, and all that was yet to come. As the dust settled over the valley, the tale found its quiet close. Yet the spirit of the frontier still rides on, carried in the stories we share and the voices of those who keep them alive. If this journey spoke to you, I invite you to stay in the saddle a little longer. Press that like button to show your trail has crossed with ours. Subscribe so you don't miss the next ride into the West. And tell us down below in the comments where you call home. From the wide plains to the farthest coasts, for every place has its own frontier, and every voice adds to the campfire circle. Until the next story rides your way, Keep your eyes on the horizon and your heart set true.